Hi everyone, this is chapter 24 of Pride and Prejudice, but if you are reading an edition which marks off the different volumes, this is the first chapter of the second volume. So it depends on what edition you're following. Some editions will call this chapter 24, others will renumber the chapter starting at every volume. So there's 3 volumes, volume 2 and volume 3, they start over at chapter 1 again. So if you're following along in the Project Gutenberg edition, which my students are, most of them, it's going to be labeled chapter 24. If you're in a different edition, you may see it written as chapter 1, but volume 2. So just be mindful of that. In the beginning of the video, I will tell you both chapter titles. That way you can follow along with whatever you're reading. All right, chapter 1 of volume 2, or 24 overall. Miss Bingley's letter arrived and put an end to doubt. The very first sentence conveyed the assurance of their being all settled in London for the winter, and concluded with her brother's regret at not having had time to pay his respects to his friends in Hertfordshire before he left the country. Hope was over, entirely over, and when Jane could attend to the rest of the letter, she found little, except the professed affection of the writer, that could give her any comfort. Miss Darcy's praise occupied the chief of it. Her many attractions were again dwelt on, and Caroline boasted joyfully of their increasing intimacy, and ventured to predict the accomplishment of the wishes which had been unfolded in her former letter. She wrote also with great pleasure of her brother's being an inmate of Mr. Darcy's house, and mentioned with raptures some plans of the latter with regard to new furniture. So Caroline now sends another letter to Jane confirming that Mr. Bingley is going to be spending the whole winter in London, and it doesn't look likely that he'll ever return to Netherfield. Moreover, she says that it looks like things are going well with Georgiana Darcy, Miss Darcy, and that they may be hitting it off and may eventually end up married. Elizabeth, to whom Jane very soon communicated the chief of all this, heard it in silent indignation. Her heart was divided between concern for her sister and resentment against all others. To Caroline's assertion of her brother's being partial to Miss Darcy, she paid no credit. That he was really fond of Jane, she doubted no more than she had ever done, and, much as she had always been disposed to like him, she could not think without anger, hardly without contempt, on that easiness of temper, that want of proper resolution, which now made him the slave of his designing friends, and led him to sacrifice his own happiness to the caprice of their inclinations. Had his own happiness, however, been the only sacrifice, he might have been allowed to sport with it in whatever manner he thought best, but her sister's was involved in it, as she thought he must be sensible himself. It was a subject, in short, on which reflection would be long indulged, and must be unavailing. She could think of nothing else, and yet, whether Bingley's regard had really died away, or were suppressed by his friend's interference, whether he had been aware of Jane's attachment, or whether it had escaped his observation, whatever were the case, though her opinion of him must be materially affected by the difference, her sister's situation remained the same, her peace equally wounded. So Elizabeth is very upset about this. She doesn't believe Caroline that Mr. Bingley is interested in Georgiana Darcy, but she's very upset with Mr. Bingley because he has that sort of want of proper resolution, on that easiness of temper. So he's very easygoing, very willing to listen to what others say, and he doesn't really set his mind in a determined fashion to anything. So in that way, he's sort of a foil for Mr. Darcy. Character foil is when you have two characters with opposite personality traits, and the fact that they are so opposite highlights the differences of each. So Mr. Darcy says that his good opinion once lost is lost forever, that he makes up his mind and does not change it. Mr. Bingley, on the other hand, is very easygoing, very go with the flow. He'll kind of follow along with anyone's suggestions. So here that really works in his disadvantage, because if he was at all interested in Jane and now people just say, oh, stay in London, and he decides to stay in London, that shows that he's not set in matters that he should really make up his mind about, and that he's not showing true affection or true feeling for Jane, at least according to the way Elizabeth's thinking. And Jane is very seriously hurt by this. A day or two passed before Jane had courage to speak of her feelings to Elizabeth, but at last, on Mrs. Bennet's leaving them together, after a longer irritation than usual about Netherfield and its master, she could not help saying, "Oh, that my dear mother had more command over herself. She can have no idea of the pain she gives me by her continual reflections on him. But I will not repine. It cannot last long. He will be forgot, and we shall all be as we were before." Elizabeth looked at her sister with incredulous solicitude, but said nothing. "You doubt me," cried Jane, slightly coloring. "Indeed you have no reason. He may live in my memory as the most amiable man of my acquaintance, but that is all. I have nothing either to hope or fear, and nothing to reproach him with. Thank God I have not that pain. A little time, therefore, I shall certainly try to get the better." With a stronger voice she soon added, "I have this comfort immediately, that it has not been more than an error of fancy on my side, and that it has done no harm to anyone but myself." So Jane is bearing this with a lot of patience. She only tells Elizabeth that Mrs. Bennet is really bothering her by constantly harping on Mr. Bingley. She says that, she just needs time to heal. She's in a little bit of pain, but at least she doesn't have to be worried or concerned now. She knows where he stands. "My dear Jane," exclaimed Elizabeth, "you are too good. Your sweetness and disinterestedness are really angelic. I do not know what to say to you. I feel as if I had never done you justice or loved you as you deserve." Miss Bennet eagerly disclaimed all extraordinary merit, and threw back the praise on her sister's warm affection. "Nay," said Elizabeth, "this is not fair. You wish to think all the world respectable, and are hurt if I speak ill of anybody. I only want to think you perfect, and you set yourself against it. Do not be afraid of my running into any excess, of my encroaching on your privilege of universal goodwill. You need not. There are few people whom I really love, and still fewer of whom I think well. The more I see of the world, the more I am dissatisfied with it. And every day confirms my belief of the inconsistency of all human characters, and of the little dependence that can be placed on the appearance of either merit or sense. I've met with 2 instances lately. One I will not mention, the other is Charlotte's marriage. It is unaccountable. In every view, it is unaccountable." So Elizabeth, they go back and forth a little bit. Jane says, "I have this comfort immediately, that has not been more than an error of fancy on my side, and that it has done no harm to anyone but myself." So she says, she kind of makes up her mind and says, at least no one else was hurt by this. It's just been me, and I just mistook what he felt. Elizabeth says, "You're a really good person. I feel like I haven't given you enough credit before for being so noble." They kind of banter back and forth a little bit, but then Elizabeth says this kind of interesting speech, especially if you think about what's happened in the past couple of chapters. So she says that I think that she tells Jane she thinks she is a really good person, and she's not likely to think that. She says about the world, the more I see of the world, the more I am dissatisfied with it. So she's been pretty disappointed with things lately. She mentions being disappointed in Charlotte marrying Mr. Collins, and she says the other, I have 2 instances lately, one I will not mention. The other instance we know from her reflections on the previous page is Mr. Bingley's inconsistency in just leaving. So she's very upset about that and is less likely to believe the goodness in people. "My dear Lizzie, do not give way to such feelings as these. They will ruin your happiness. You do not make allowance enough for difference of situation and temper. Consider Mr. Collins' respectability and Charlotte's prudent, steady character. Remember that she is one of a large family, that as to fortune, it is a most eligible match, and be ready to believe, for everybody's sake, that she may feel something like regard and esteem for our cousin. To oblige you, I would try to believe almost anything, but no one else could be benefited by such a belief as this. For were I persuaded that Charlotte had any regard for him, I should only think worse of her understanding than I now do of her heart. My dear Jane, Mr. Collins is a conceited, pompous, narrow-minded, silly man. You know he is, as well as I do, and you must feel, as well as I do, that the woman who marries him cannot have a proper way of thinking. You shall not defend her, though it is Charlotte Lucas. You shall not, for the sake of one individual, change the meaning of principle and integrity, nor endeavor to persuade yourself or me that selfishness is prudence, and insensibility of danger, security for happiness." So Elizabeth is criticizing Jane's thoughts a little bit, and she's saying, "You're not going to change my mind about Charlotte. You're not going to just say that she's, making all these choices for the right reason. I know otherwise." "I must think your language too strong in speaking of both," replied Jane, "and I hope you will be convinced of it by seeing them happy together. But enough of this. You alluded to something else. You mentioned 2 instances. I cannot misunderstand you, but I entreat you, dear Lizzie, not to pain me by thinking that person to blame, and saying your opinion of him is sunk. We must not be so ready to fancy ourselves intentionally injured. We must not expect a lively young man to be always so guarded and circumspect. It is very often nothing but our own vanity that deceives us. Women fancy admiration means more than it does, and men take care that they should. If it is designedly done, they cannot be justified, but I have no idea of there being so much design in the world as some persons imagine. So Jane is defending Mr. Bingley now and saying, don't blame him for what's happened. Men can't always be so careful with what they do. It's very often nothing but our own vanity that deceives us. Women fancy admiration means more than it does. So she says, I probably thought too much of the situation and that he cared for me more than he actually did. And then Elizabeth comes back with this, and men take care that they should. So Elizabeth is suggesting maybe that Bingley kind of led Jane on. And Jane does admit if men are doing that intentionally, that's not good. I am far from attributing any part of Mr. Bingley's conduct to design, said Elizabeth, but without scheming to do wrong or to make others unhappy, there may be error and there may be misery. Thoughtlessness, want of attention to other people's feelings, and want of resolution will do the business. So Elizabeth said it doesn't matter if someone means to hurt someone else or not. Sometimes being thoughtless is in itself a bad thing. And do you impute it to either of those? Yes, to the last, but if I go on, I shall displease you by saying what I think of persons you esteem. Stop me whilst you can. You persist, then, in supposing his sisters influenced him. Yes, in conjunction with his friend. I cannot believe it. Why should they try to influence him? They can only wish his happiness, and if he's attached to me, no other woman can secure it. Your first position is false. They may wish many things besides his happiness. They may wish his increase of wealth and consequence. They may wish him to marry a girl who has all the importance of money, great connections, and pride. Beyond a doubt, they do wish him to choose Miss Darcy, replied Jane. But this may be from better feelings than you are supposing. They have known her much longer than they have known me. No wonder if they love her better. But whatever may be their own wishes, it is very unlikely that they should have opposed their brothers. What sister would think herself at liberty to do it, unless there was something very objectionable? If they believed him attached to me, they would not try to part us. If he were so, they could not succeed. By supposing such an affection, you make everybody acting unnaturally and wrong, and me most unhappy. Do not distress me by the idea. I am not ashamed of having been mistaken, or at least it is slight. It is nothing in comparison of what I should feel in thinking ill of him or his sisters. Let me take it in the best light, in the light in which it may be understood. Elizabeth could not oppose such a wish, and from this time Mr. Bingley's name was scarcely ever mentioned between them. So again, Jane gives him the benefit of the doubt, and she also gives his sisters the benefit of the doubt and says, what good sister would take their brother away from someone that he really cares about if that were the case? They may like Miss Darcy better than me, but they've known her for a very long time, and they haven't known me very long. Mrs. Bennet still continued to wonder and repine at his returning no more, and though a day seldom passed in which Elizabeth did not account for it clearly, there seemed little chance of her ever considering it with less perplexity. Her daughter endeavored to convince her of what she did not believe herself, that his attentions to Jane had been merely the effect of a common and transient liking, which ceased when he saw her no more. But though the probability of the statement was admitted at the time, she had the same story to repeat every day. Mrs. Bennet's best comfort was that Mr. Bingley must be down again in the summer. So Mrs. Bennet is still determined that Jane and Bingley will marry. She's looking forward to him being back in the summer, but she's very upset that he is not there for the winter, and she, again, keeps harping on it, talking about it, further upsetting Jane. Mr. Bennet treated the matter differently. So, Lizzie, said he one day, your sister is crossed in love, I find. I congratulate her. Next to being married, a girl likes to be crossed in love a little now and then. It is something to think of, and gives her a sort of distinction among her companions. When is your turn to come? You will hardly bear to be long outdone by Jane. Now is your time. Here are officers enough at Meryton to disappoint all the young ladies in the country. Let Wickham be your man. He is a pleasant fellow, and would jilt you creditably. Thank you, sir, but a less agreeable man would satisfy me. We must not all expect Jane's good fortune. True, said Mr. Bennet, but it is a comfort to think that, whatever of that kind may befall you, you have an affectionate mother who will always make the most of it. So Elizabeth and Mr. Bennet are having a little bit of a witty conversation. Mr. Bennet says, oh, every girl likes to be a little frustrated when she falls in love. It gives her something to talk about. All her friends are very interested in her story. It gives her a sort of distinction. And Elizabeth takes her father's joking with good humor. He mentions Wickham would be a good candidate to jilt Elizabeth. So again, very playful, sarcastic Mr. Bennet. Mr. Wickham's society was of material service in dispelling the gloom which the late perverse occurrences had thrown on many of the Longbourn family. They saw him often, and to his other recommendations was now added that of general unreserve. The whole of what Elizabeth had already heard, his claims on Mr. Darcy, and all that he had suffered from him, was now openly acknowledged and publicly canvassed. So Mr. Wickham is now sharing with everyone, now that Mr. Darcy is out of the country, what has happened, so their past, their family background. And everybody was pleased to think how much they had always disliked Mr. Darcy before they had known anything of the matter. So everyone's like, yeah, great, we already disliked Mr. Darcy, now we have confirmation that we were justified in hating him. Miss Bennet was the only creature who could suppose there might be any extenuating circumstances in the case unknown to the society of Hertfordshire. Her mild and steady candor always pleaded for allowances, and urged the possibility of mistakes. But by everybody else, Mr. Darcy was condemned as the worst of men. So only Jane still thinks maybe there's some sort of extenuating circumstance that has explained what Mr. Darcy did to Wickham. And that was chapter 24, or chapter 1 of volume 2.